The rhythm of the heart monitor had been the room's only pulse, a fragile metronome I'd been tracking all shift. For hours, I watched its green line stretch, the peaks becoming shallower, the valleys wider. It was a slow, inevitable surrender, the sound thinning until it was barely a whisper against the hospital's hum. Then, silence. A single, unwavering note that hung in the air, stark and absolute. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:42 in the afternoon. A time I would chart, a fact for a file. That was the moment St. Joseph Medical Center would officially mark as Eleanor Cole's end. But for the woman sitting vigil, Marion Cole, I knew the real departure had been a quieter, more private affair. I sensed it had happened long before the machine confirmed it. I remembered seeing her through the glass during my rounds, a silhouette against the pre-dawn grey. She was just sitting there, her hand enveloping Eleanor's, a silent anchor in a receding tide. I'd watched her listen to the fading breaths, each one a little softer, a little more distant than the last. The room was a pocket of stillness, bathed in the cool, sterile glow from the hallway. Now, in the aftermath, Marion stood utterly alone. I could hear the life of the hospital outside the door, the squeak of a cart's wheels, the low murmur of conversations, the muffled sobs of another family down the hall. They were islands of shared grief, huddled together against the same loss. But none of that human warmth seemed to penetrate the invisible wall around this room. Her husband, Alex, was a name on a form, not a presence in a chair. His sister, Stephanie, a number we never had to dial. Throughout my 12-hour shift, not a single call had come through for her. The silence from the Cole family was louder than the final tone of the monitor. It wasn't just neglect. It felt like a deliberate erasure. The only other soul in that space was me, a stranger in scrubs, my own fatigue, a dull ache in my bones. I saw in her posture a weariness that went far beyond a sleepless night. There's a particular compassion you learn in this job, a quiet respect for the finality of it all. I moved toward the bed, my rubber soles whispering on the linoleum. My hands, moving on instinct, gently smoothed the thin blanket over Eleanor's still form. It was a small, useless gesture of dignity, the last I could offer, before I turned to the one left behind. I met Marion's gaze, trying to offer a moment of genuine human connection in the void. From my pocket, I retrieved the envelope Eleanor had given me yesterday, its paper soft and creased from her frail hands. I placed it into Marion's palm, my voice low. Before she slept, she kept asking me to give this only to you. She insisted this find its way to you. The nurse's voice was a soft intrusion, a practiced whisper for the newly bereaved. Only after, well, after. The finality of the word hung in the air long after the door clicked shut. For a long moment, I watched Marion just stand there, her fingers refusing to obey the impulse to open the plain white envelope. She was a lone figure in that silent, sterile room, where the drone of the fluorescent fixtures seemed to harmonize with the ghost of that last, terrible, unending beep. Then, with a ragged breath that I could almost feel, she broke the seal. Her fingers, I noticed, trembled, not with grief, but with a kind of dread. Inside, nestled against the cheap paper, was a key. It was old, silver, its edges worn dark with time and use. Beside it, a single slip of paper lay waiting, a final confession. On it was an address, a place I knew was hidden away in the deepest part of the Washington forest. And just beneath those coordinates, penned in a script that was achingly familiar, was the elegant, sharp handwriting of Eleanor, forming a final, chilling decree. The first line was a simple, brutal truth. They never loved me. The second was a curse. Let them learn what it means to be forgotten. I saw the words land on Marion, a chill that sank deeper than the conditioned air of that lifeless room ever could. Her expression hardened. She carefully folded the note, placing it and the key back into the envelope, sliding the weighted secret into her coat pocket. The moment she stepped back into the corridor, the world rushed back in. The hospital seemed to scream with life too loud, too bright, an insult to the silence Eleanor had left behind. The world was already forgetting. I watched Marion move through the chaos, a phantom walking toward the light of the exit, her gait slow, weighed down by more than just sorrow. The space in her chest, once hollowed by loss, was now being filled with something else, something cold and heavy. A covenant had been made in that room. A torch passed, and I saw the flame ignite behind her eyes. As her hand met the cold steel bar of the exit door, she stepped out, not into sun, but into the flat, oppressive grey of the Tacoma afternoon. She reached her car, but made no move to start it. She simply sat behind the wheel, motionless, the silence inside the car a perfect mirror for the storm gathering within her. Her hands were a dead weight on my steering wheel, the pressure unchanging. Her stare passed through my glass, focused on a reality I couldn't reflect. My windshield merely showed the late afternoon sun bleeding across the asphalt, a slow, golden stain spreading over the hospital parking lot. I could feel the faint, sharp-cornered outline of something in her pocket pressing into the seat. A small, rigid envelope containing a key that seemed to possess its own gravity, holding her fast. It felt heavier than metal, a weight my suspension couldn't measure. For nearly 30 minutes my engine ticked and cooled, the silence inside absolute. She was a ghost behind the wheel, a portrait of stillness and shock. A solitude radiated from her, so dense it felt like the damp chill of a Pacific Northwest fog seeping right through my steel frame. Then, a tremor, a decision. The key turned in my ignition, and I roared to life. We moved, pulling away from the cold brick of St. Joseph Medical Center. The sounds of the city reached us as if from a great distance, every noise muffled, as though the world had been wrapped in cotton. The turns into her Tacoma neighborhood were instinctual, a memory in her muscles. Then, a new tremor started, a frantic buzzing from the cup holder that rattled my console. Her gaze fell to the phone, a small, demanding square of light in the gloom. On its screen, a single name glowed. Alex. I felt the pause, a deep intake of breath that seemed to last an eternity. But the fight went out of her, and a tired finger slid across the glass. Hey! A voice erupted from my speakers, impossibly cheerful. It was a sound from another world, casual and completely unaware of the weight inside my cabin. Are you still out? If you're stopping somewhere, can you grab milk and maybe some bread? The words tumbled out, oblivious. I didn't get a chance to go. Earlier, her eyelids fluttered shut, blocking out the light, the road, everything. The phone in her hand groaned under the sudden, immense pressure. Alex, she breathed, and the name was a flat, dead thing in the quiet of my interior. From here, I watched her face, a mask of calm as the voice on the other end delivered the news like a stone. Your mother passed. The time was 3:42. A chasm of silence opened on the line, a void so profound it felt, less like the weight of sorrow and more like the hum of a machine recalibrating, a mind searching for the correct, least disruptive protocol for a conversation that had suddenly become an obstacle. Oh, the voice finally returned, thin and distant. Well, I was in meetings. You know how it is. We can sort out the logistics. The words trailed off into static. Just come home when you can. Each syllable was a careful sidestep, a deflection that I saw land not like a fresh blade in Marion's chest, but like the slow turning of a key in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. The utter lack of surprise was the cruelest part, a familiar ache that had long since lost its shock, but never its venom. The line went dead. No goodbye was offered. Later, as her key slid into the lock, she pushed the door open into a house that had exhaled all its warmth. A palpable chill clung to the air, a cold that radiated from within the walls themselves, unwelcoming, a hollowed-out stage set only pretending to be a home. Alex, of course, was not there. His absence was a presence. A game replay murmured from the television, its ghostly blue light flickering across the empty sofa, a forgotten echo from the night before. Sleep would not take Marion. She lay perfectly still long after midnight, listening, but the silence that pressed in on her had changed its very nature. It was no longer peace, it was a vacuum, the sound of absolute emptiness. I saw the recognition dawn in the darkness. She had crossed a threshold, an invisible line from which there was no return. Whatever, her life had been just hours before, it had fractured, becoming a photograph of a stranger. It wasn't her world anymore. Outside, the sky had barely begun to bleed into grey. The first tremor disturbed the silence not as a sound, but as a feeling, a faint hum on the edge of my awareness. It was the song of an engine, a rhythm of the outside world, approaching the forested artery that leads to me. I felt it travel the long road, a summons I had put out long ago, finally being answered. The woman inside the machine couldn't know me, but she held the key, a faded map of memory. Eleanor's hand had traced the path, a final whispered instruction on a fragile slip of paper. This place has no name on the maps of men. It is a location known only by the heart. I watched as her vessel, a dark beetle against the green, left the structured world behind. The smog of Tacoma gave way to the sharp, clean scent of pine and damp, ancient earth. She turned onto the winding back roads, the forgotten veins that pulse with the life of the woods, drawing ever deeper, into the quiet dominion of the Olympic Peninsula, where the world's noise comes to die. As the miles dissolved behind her, the silence grew, becoming a living presence. The asphalt frayed, surrendering to a dirt path I have kept hidden for generations. My overgrown arms reached for her, long branches of fir and cedar brushing against metal. They tapped on her windows, a soft, drumming inquiry from the wilderness itself, a gentle test, a question asked in the language of rustling leaves and creaking wood. I needed to know her resolve, to feel the intent behind her journey. The canopy of trees thickened above, my boughs draped in the green velvet of moss. Light became a scarce commodity, filtering down in shifting, ghostly patterns on the ground. Yet, this woman, Marion, continued her pilgrimage, her focus unwavering. I felt the steady, measured beat of her presence, a calm that resonated through the earth. She was guided not by sight, but by the ghost of a promise, by Eleanor's coordinates. A sacred trust, passed on only after the silence had claimed its keeper. At last, I parted the veil of trees, allowing the path to open into my small, sun-dappled clearing. And there I was, revealed, a faded sanctuary of wood and memory. I, the cabin, nestled beneath the towering firs that have stood as my guardians for an age, watched over by the tangled, thorny arms of wild roses that Eleanor herself had planted. Time has stripped my painted skin, leaving behind the muted tones of my true self. Streaks of weathered grey and clinging green, the colours of the forest that is reclaiming me. But my frame stands solid, a stubborn testament against the slow, patient siege of nature, as if I knew this moment was coming, as if I have been waiting only for her, a presence. I felt her before I saw her, stepping into the air that I had held, cool and heavy with the familiar ghosts of cedar and the promise of rain, a scent Eleanor had cherished. The soft earth gave way beneath her boots, a reluctant sigh. She moved toward my door, a shadow cutting through the gloom, and from her coat she drew the old key, the one I knew so well, still holding the last of Eleanor's warmth against her palm. It found its home in the old lock, turning without a whisper of protest. And then I exhaled, letting her inside. My breath was a carefully layered perfume of lavender, honest dust, and the soul of old wood. The sun, a pale ghost, filtered through my clouded eyes, draping a soft haze over the spines of books that had kept Eleanor's secrets for years. No, this was not abandonment. This was a stage, meticulously set. A memory Eleanor had polished and left under glass, a perfect, silent world she had sealed away from all the noise. I watched Marion drift through the main room, her movements slow, almost reverent, absorbing the dense, quiet intimacy I held. The blanket on the chair, folded just so, still held the shape of a final rest. The empty mug sat beside a stack of paperbacks, a silent, finished toast. Near the window, dried herbs hung like sleeping sentinels, their purpose fulfilled. Every object was a verse in her last poem. And there, on the kitchen table, the centerpiece of it all, lay the final envelope, its edges sharp against the soft veil of dust. It was a beacon in the stillness, and upon it, Eleanor's hand, so clear and resolute, had inscribed the final instructions, to be delivered to my attorney. Marion just stood there, frozen. I saw her gaze fix upon it, saw the subtle catch in her breath that signaled the precise moment the pieces clicked into place. The story was complete, and there had been no accident here. I watched her realize these were not the random keepsakes of a life concluded. Eleanor had not left her fragments. She had passed on a mantle, something meticulously constructed, something of immense weight, a responsibility whose true scale was only now beginning to dawn on her. And so, Marian hesitated, refusing to break the seal on the second envelope. Not yet. First, she needed to feel the world outside these walls. She carried it like an unexploded ordnance onto the small, damp porch, her fingers flexing in the cool air, gathering herself before delving into yet another secret Eleanor had so carefully laid in her path. The forest surrounding us stood in silent judgment, a vast, breathing entity. The only sound was the percussive drip, drip, drip of the night's rain slipping like tears from the heavy boughs. When she finally drew that cold rectangle of technology from her pocket, and her finger traced the number inked upon the envelope, I sensed she was bracing for the hollow tone of an unanswered call. But the connection was immediate, a voice slicing through the wilderness. Alice Vanderbilt speaking. It was a voice forged in boardrooms, a voice of cool, steady command, the kind that belonged to someone who managed empires, not emotions. I listened as Marian's own voice sounded small, a fragile thing against the backdrop of the woods, as she explained her own existence in relation to the woman who had slipped into the great silence just the day before. A pause hung in the air, brief but dense with unspoken meaning. "I'm very sorry to hear that," Alice said, her tone a perfect measured sympathy. "And yes," she continued, the words landing like stones in a still pond, "I've been expecting her call." That specific phrasing, so deliberate, I saw the chill ripple across Marian's skin, a physical reaction. There was no shock in Alice's tone, none at all. Only a profound readiness, the quiet click of a final piece falling into place, as if Eleanor had orchestrated this very conversation from beyond the veil. "Precision," Alice continued. "There are instructions we must follow exactly. The reading of the will cannot proceed unless everyone Eleanor named is present. That includes your husband, Alex Cole, Jr., and his sister, Stephanie Cole. They must attend." Marian agreed, though her mind tightened at the thought. That evening, when Alex finally came home and Stephanie arrived, not long after, Marian tried to explain, she told them Eleanor had left instructions that the attorney needed, all of them in the same room. Alex chuckled under his breath. Stephanie rolled her eyes dramatically. "A will?" Stephanie scoffed. She had nothing. "What's there to read? Old sweaters and mystery novels." Alex added, "Mom lived off Social Security and complaints." "Don't build this up, Marian." They laughed together, dismissing Eleanor's life, her death, and everything in between. Marian said nothing. She didn't tell them about the cabin hidden deep in the Quinnell rainforest. She didn't mention the key that had turned so smoothly in the lock. She didn't reveal the second envelope sitting untouched on the kitchen table up there meant only for the lawyer, Alice Vanderbilt, to arrive. From my corner, I watched them, a quiet certainty settling in my bones. I knew Eleanor, and I knew that those two hadn't the faintest clue what my old friend had set in motion. And for the first time, I noticed there was no fear in Marian's eyes, only a calm stillness. Alice Vanderbilt's practice was housed on the fourth floor of a stoic, old brick building, a place that had seen decades of Tacoma's history unfold over the grey ribbon of Pacific Avenue below. The conference room, where we all sat, felt unnervingly bright, a stage set for a drama far too somber for a morning like this. The sunlight, sharp and clinical, streamed through the tall, arched windows, glancing off the polished mahogany and the stark white edges of meticulously stacked files. Marian, bless her, found a seat at the far end of the long table, a small, still island, with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Then Alex and Stephanie blew in, their argument about a parking spot, echoing their usual discord before they collapsed into their leather chairs with theatrical, impatient sighs. My friend and I, Eleanor's companions for more than 50 years, sat just a little ways off, our purses clutched in our laps like anchors. In this sea of quiet tension, I saw Marian's gaze flicker towards us, a brief, silent acknowledgement. I suppose she recognized us from the little silver-framed photos Eleanor kept on her bedside table. The moment Alice Vanderbilt entered, the air thickened, and even the bickering airs fell into a stilted, respectful silence. Her greeting was a single sharp nod that took us all in, before she placed a heavy, cream-colored folder on the table before her. "Thank you all for being here." Her voice was crisp, cutting through the quiet. "We are gathered to read the last will and testament. Testament of Eleanor Cole." The name hung in the air, heavy and final. I watched Alice, her expression unreadable, as she explained how meticulously the deceased had outlined her wishes. Every detail of this very process. Stephanie shifted, a sharp, resentful movement, her arms folding into a defensive wall. "Can we just get on with it?" she bit out. Alice offered no reaction, her composure a perfect, cold mask as she opened the folder. The crisp sound of paper was the only reply before her voice cut through the silence. "To my son, Alex Cole Jr." I saw it then, a flicker of smug victory lighting up Alex's face. It was a predator's smile, just before the words landed. "I leave forgiveness," and nothing else. The smile didn't just fade, it shattered like glass. A harsh, choked sound, more of a bark than a laugh, tore from his throat. It was the sound of pure disbelief colliding with a deeply wounded ego. Alice, however, read on as if she hadn't just detonated a bomb. "To my daughter, Stephanie Cole, I leave the great wedding ring she once so admired and tried to take. May it serve as a reminder that promises still matter." A muscle jumped in Stephanie's jaw, a tiny, violent tremor. The blood drained from her face, leaving behind a pallor of pure fury. "To my dear friends, Margaret Hole and Diane Weaver, I leave these financial gifts in recognition of their many years of loyalty and kindness." A sudden warmth entered the frozen room. The two women looked at each other, their eyes glistening with genuine sorrow and gratitude, whispering words I couldn't quite hear. And then Alice's gaze shifted. It was a deliberate, weighty movement as her eyes found Marion. "And to Marion Cole, I leave everything else. The cabin property, all remaining savings, personal belongings, and the entirety of the insurance benefits." The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where all the air had been sucked out. Alex launched himself from his chair as if propelled. "This is a joke," he spat, his voice cracking with rage. She was confused. Someone was in her ear. The word manipulated hung in the air, a poison dart aimed at me. Then Stephanie's voice, sharp as broken glass, joined her brother's. I saw the tremor in her jaw, a tiny betrayal of the venom in her tone as she spat. "We will take this to court. Our mother must have been coerced." The word landed, and both their eyes burned into me, branding me a thief. But Alice, ever the calm center of the storm, didn't even flinch. Her hand moved with deliberate grace, retrieving another sealed envelope from the depths of the leather folder. Alice's voice was cool, cutting through their rage. Eleanor anticipated this reaction. She underwent a complete psychiatric evaluation just 1 week before she signed this document. And with that, Alice slid a heavy, certified report across the polished mahogany. It came to a stop before them. The report confirms she was entirely competent. I watched the fury in Alex's eyes gutter like a dying flame, though he fought to keep it lit. He clung to that last ember of outrage as Alice added, her voice dropping slightly, and produced a small, metallic flash drive from her pocket. She also recorded a video, in her own words, explaining her decisions. "It will be presented to the court should you choose to proceed." The threat, delivered so calmly, was absolute. A silence descended on the room, so thick and heavy it felt like a physical weight. I watched Alex slowly sink back into his chair, the fight drained from him. Stephanie turned her head, staring at the window, blinking rapidly, her manufactured fury dissolving into a mist of defeat. And just like that, the grand illusion they'd lived under, the certainty of their inheritance, shattered into a million pieces. And in that deafening quiet, I, Marion, who had said nothing, felt it. The immense, terrifying weight of Eleanor's final trust settling upon my shoulders. It wasn't just in my hands, it was in my very soul. The soft click of Alice closing the folder seemed to fracture the tense, suffocating silence, and the spell was broken. Alex violently shoved his chair back, the legs screaming a protest against the polished wooden floor. He was muttering something dark and bitter, a poison meant only for himself. Stephanie was right behind him, her retreat marked by the sharp, angry strike of her heels on the floorboards, a staccato of fury as she marched toward the hallway, and then the final, percussive slam of the door that plunged the office into a thick, ringing silence. In the aftermath, only Marian and the two elderly women, Eleanor's true friends, remained, suspended in the shared disbelief that hung in the air. I watched as Margaret and Diane murmured, hushed, inadequate words of comfort, their movements stiff as they excused themselves, their eyes filled with a profound pity for the woman who had just inherited a life from a family that never truly claimed her. When the latch clicked shut, a sound that felt deafeningly final, Alice turned, her gaze to Marian, her professional mask dissolving into something softer. "There is one last piece of instruction," she said, her voice low. From the deep, mahogany drawer of her desk, she produced a small, fragile-looking envelope addressed in a familiar, spidery script, to Marian and Marian alone. The paper itself seemed to breathe history, far more aged than the formal will, as if Eleanor had penned this final testament long before the sterile walls of the hospital became her last horizon. Alice presented it with both hands, a gesture of almost sacred reverence. She asked, Alice began, her eyes meeting Marian's, "that I give this only to you." After the formal reading was concluded, her tone left no room for doubt. She was absolutely clear on that point. Marian's fingers trembled slightly as she took it, then opened the delicate seal. Inside, a single, stark line of ink stood on the page, a ghost of Eleanor's unmistakable hand, a final command rising from the page: "Forgive no one, let them come crawling. When they do, smile and turn away." The words carried a chilling gravity, a weight far greater than the small, cold key from the cabin, heavier, even, than the staggering weight of the inheritance itself, had forged a chasm between Alex and Stephanie, turning them into strangers. That script wasn't a legal document. It was a confession, a legacy of pure feeling, so raw and unfiltered that its truth was a blade. I watched Alice observe her, a silent guardian of the moment. Eleanor's choice wasn't about convenience. Her voice was a soft murmur. Against my old wood, it wasn't the easy path. The quiet in the room seemed to hold its breath. She chose you because you were the one soul who stayed, who never once measured her worth by what you could receive. All of this, her gesture encompassing me, my land, my secrets, was her last defiant breath, and she needed you to be its keeper. I saw Marian's hands fold the paper, the slight tremor in her fingers betraying a strength she was just beginning to feel as she secreted the letter away inside her coat. When she finally stepped through my door, the crisp Tacoma air felt like a baptism, and the true weight of my history, of Eleanor's life, settled over her completely. She never asked for this crown, this kingdom of memories, but now it belonged to her entirely. I felt different when Marian returned. The mystery I held had dissolved, replaced by a quiet hum of expectation, as if my very timbers knew a promise was about to be fulfilled within my walls. She shut the door, and the sound wasn't an ending, but a beginning. She let my silence wash over her, a communion, before her feet found the narrow staircase leading up to the place where memories sleep. My floorboards sang their familiar creaking song beneath her, a scent, the small sounds rippling through my bones, disturbing the dust that danced like forgotten dreams in the shafts of weak light. I felt the slight pressure change as she pushed the attic door inward. Before her lay a lifetime, not of clutter, but of carefully curated memory, a silent archive of a forgotten life. Old trunks sealed with dust, splintered wooden crates, and shelves where meticulously labeled boxes stood in perfect, ordered rows. It was a museum of one. You could feel that someone had spent decades curating the artifacts of a life, a story that absolutely no one had ever bothered to read. I watched as Marian's fingers lifted the lid of the first box. Inside lay bundles of letters, held together by ribbons that had long ago surrendered their color to time, their postmarks ghosts from different eras, some envelopes, still crisp, others yellowed and fragile with the slow burn of years. Another, the box was heavy with journals, dozens of them, a silent chorus, their spines softened and worn from being a sole confidant. She carried an armful down the stairs, their weight a sudden, tangible grief, placing them on the old kitchen table. The first journal she coaxed open began with the ghost of Eleanor's elegant, looping handwriting. It was so steady at first, a confident line of ink, then becoming a fragile tremor on the page as the years wore on. With every turned page, a life unfolded, a narrative marked, not by some great sweeping tragedy, but by the quiet, relentless corrosion that comes from being completely and utterly overlooked. She wrote of the hollow years, after her husband was gone, describing how the holidays began to bleed into one another, a smear of meaningless dates, how she would set the dinner table out of sheer haunting habit, a feast for phantoms she knew would never arrive. She wrote about the annual ritual of calling Alex on Thanksgiving and hearing the cold, impersonal click of his voicemail for the 6th year in a row. She wrote about Stephanie, whose visits were timed only to the rhythm of her own empty wallet, always leaving in a hurry, always pretending, with a practiced blindness, not to see the profound loneliness that clung to the very air of that house, the walls. I held those words, you see. Scratched onto paper, they were echoes of the sorrow that had long ago seeped into my plaster. Chilled Marian. Short, painful lines. I watched the cold bloom on her skin, a familiar frost I once felt emanating from Eleanor in the dead of night, written late at night. I heard families, penned when the world was asleep, when the only sounds were my own groaning timbers and the distant laughter from the street, laughing outside today. I used to have laughter that felt like it belonged to another lifetime, a sound that no longer knew how to enter these rooms, that once I washed the good plates even though no. I remember the ritual, the gentle clink of fine china being washed in an empty kitchen, a hopeful prayer against the coming silence. One is coming, and then inevitably, maybe the children. Then, the almost imperceptible shift in the ink, the anatomy of a heart turning inward. Aren't cruel. Maybe I'm simply. The question that haunted my hallways, not a condemnation of them, but a quiet erasure of herself, unnecessary. Marian felt her throat tighten. Near I saw her hand flutter to her neck, as if the very dust in the air, thick with memory, was choking her. Bottom of one crate, she found a small. Her fingers, sifting through the layers of a life, brushed against something hard-edged and foreign. Envelope, marked in a different hand. Firmer, distinctly masculine. Inside was a script I recognized, bold, certain, from a time when these rooms were filled with a different kind of presence. A letter from Eleanor's late husband, written years earlier, if you're reading. His voice, reaching across time from a sealed page, a final contingency. This, it means I am gone. Nain, do not. That name. Nain. A whisper of tenderness I hadn't felt within my walls for an eternity. Reward the ones who abandoned you. Leave. A shield forged in foresight, a command to protect her own aching heart. Your heart to those who truly deserve. A final, desperate plea to place her love where it would be cherished, not merely tolerated. Tit, even if it is not our children. Marian sat motionless for a long time. The sun slanted through the window, painting stripes of light across the floor, and still she remained, a statue carved of revelation. The letter resting in her lap, that fragile piece of paper lay upon her, heavier than a tombstone. Weight of Eleanor's choices. The architecture of Eleanor's final years, every decision, every locked door, suddenly stood before her, that once seemed harsh, now made. What had looked like the cold stone of resentment was revealed to be a fortress built to shelter a flickering flame, devastating sense. The will, the The logic of it all was a brutal, heartbreaking blow. Instructions, the secrecy, none of it. The clandestine meetings, the carefully worded documents, the wall of silence, had been born of bitterness. It had been. This wasn't the fruit of bitterness. I knew that. I had felt its true origin, born of a lifetime of silent suffering, and Marian finally understood. Eleanor. In the quiet of that room, Marian finally saw the woman I had watched for so long hadn't been seeking revenge. She had. It was never about retribution. It was an act of preservation, has been fighting for a soul I held within my pages, a heart that had been cast into shadow far too many times. I watched from the table as Marian, just days after sifting through another chapter of my existence, of Eleanor's life, saw a stark white envelope slice through the silence, landing on the floor of her Tacoma home. The embossed seal on its face was a venomous sigil. I saw the color drain from her face before her fingers even touched it. Inside, the words were a declaration of war, written on court documents. Alex, Stephanie. Their names were a familiar poison, staining the clean paper. They were challenging the will, their accusations a grotesque mural of lies that Eleanor, my creator, had been a pawn. Her mind broken, her final act of defiance a thing of coercion. Marian sank into a chair at her kitchen table, the weight of the typed venom pressing down on her, the letters blurring into a meaningless haze. For a long, suspended moment, the room was utterly still. She had braced for their fury, for bitter words, even for new menaces. But this cold, legal assault, seeing their lies in official print, struck a far deeper chord of violation. This wasn't merely a rejection of Eleanor's last wish. It was an attempt to annihilate her very memory. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the phone to call Alice. "I've received something," was all she managed, her voice a fragile thread. "I thought you might." Alice's reply was a calm, steadying current. Eleanor saw this coming. She made preparations. She was more ready for this battle than you can possibly imagine. The words were a shield. A fragile strength returned to Marian's posture, but it couldn't dispel the dread that had taken root deep within her chest. A day later, she walked into Alice's downtown office, ready for the storm. I watched as a single manila folder rested on the polished wood, a stark island of order. It was on the attorney's desk, its contents a silent, waiting arsenal. This was the file Eleanor had meticulously prepared, a final directive from beyond. She left recordings. Alice's voice was calm, a sharp tap of her finger punctuating the statement. Her nail clicked against a small, neat row of flash drives, each one precisely labeled. Every visit, she'd explained, every conversation, every single calculated moment of dismissal, every time they made her feel invisible, it was all captured. Each file was dated, each one verified. I saw Marian flinch, a slow, disbelieving blink. The word hung in the air between them. Recordings. Yes, Alice confirmed, and all legally airtight, with her consent clearly stated. It was a masterclass in preparation, a careful navigation of Washington's complex laws. The state's two-party consent statutes are a minefield for the unprepared, but Eleanor, it seemed, had walked it like a seasoned soldier. A faint, almost sad smile touched Alice's lips. It wasn't one of triumph. She was determined that the truth wouldn't be buried with her. Then came the day. The Pierce County courtroom felt like a tomb when the date finally arrived. A sterile coldness seeped from the marble floors, a chill Marian clearly felt. Alex was a statue of tension next to his lawyer, a man carved from regret. His jaw was a knot, his eyes darting to the ceiling, the walls anywhere but toward Marian. Behind him, Stephanie was a storm cloud, her arms locked across her chest. You could almost see the bitterness radiating off her, a shimmering heat of resentment. Alex's counsel began, his voice smooth as he spun a tale with sweeping gestures. He spoke of diminished capacity, the words clinical and cruel. He painted a portrait of emotional vulnerability, of a mind easily swayed, and then he pointed his narrative dagger at Marian, speaking of her undue influence. He was trying to erase the Eleanor I knew, the woman from the recordings. He rendered her last months as a fog of confusion, a twilight of the mind, a caricature of weakness. And in the silence that followed, Alice stood. She didn't speak. She simply held up the psychiatric evaluation, dated just 1 week before Eleanor signed her final testament. The doctor's words cut through the courtroom's stale air, each one a perfectly polished stone of fact. Eleanor's mind had been a fortress, he explained, completely sound, her awareness absolute, her final act a product of pure, unclouded intention. Then came the disembodied voice. I watched the judge lean forward slightly as the audio logs began to play. Eleanor's voice filled the space, not frail, but with a quiet, resolute cadence that belied her age. She recounted Stephanie's visits, brief as a bird landing on a wire, before flitting away. She spoke of the deafening silence from Alex, of holidays where the only guest was her own reflection. You could hear it in her tone, not just sadness, but the slow, chilling crystallization of a terrible truth, that to her children she had become little more than a future inheritance, a name on a bank account. Their love, it seemed, had a price tag. The final piece of evidence was presented by Alice, a video file from an ordinary cell phone. And there was Eleanor, her face etched with a weary wisdom, looking not at the camera, but through it. It was a message stripped of all artifice, explaining with devastating simplicity why Marion, the woman who had offered companionship, was her heir, and why her own bloodline would receive nothing beyond what their own actions had merited. As the video ended, the silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. The judge's face, once a mask of impartiality, had become granite. The ruling was an avalanche, sudden and unstoppable, delivered without a moment's pause. The challenge to the will was summarily dismissed. Eleanor's final wish was to be honored, exactly as she had decreed. Then came the final, crushing blow for Alex and Stephanie. They were ordered to cover every last cent of the legal fees. I glanced over at Marion, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw a subtle change in her posture, a release of tension she hadn't even known was there. It wasn't the gloating of a winner, nor the simple exhale of relief. It was the profound, quiet gravity of knowing that a deep and painful truth had finally been heard and had spoken for itself. A verdict like that doesn't stay behind closed doors. The news bled out into the city, spreading through the quiet streets of Tacoma like wildfire in a dry field. Within a week, the story found its way into print, a concise, sharp-edged article in the local paper. I saw it in the Tacoma Tribune, a cold summary of their downfall condensed into a few stark, unforgiving paragraphs. The article clinically noted the siblings' audacious attempt to tear apart their own mother's final will. It spoke of the court's swift, almost disdainful rejection and the judge's final twist of the knife, a ruling that they would bear the full weight of all legal costs. The tone was deliberately flat, but for anyone who knew them, who watched from the sidelines, you could feel the profound, searing humiliation bleeding through the ink. That small article didn't just ripple. It poisoned the waters of the social ponds that Alex and Stephanie so desperately needed to survive. I watched neighbors who once shared easy laughter over the fence with Stephanie now suddenly find their gaze fixed on the pavement when she approached, a sudden, shared preoccupation with anything but her. At her office, the chill was just as palpable. You could almost see the air thicken around her. Laughter would die in an instant, the moment she walked into the break room. The usual flurry of after-work invitations simply ceased to exist in her inbox. No one uttered a single word of condemnation, but the shunning was as clear as a locked door. People instinctively recoil from the kind of person who would be so publicly revealed to have tried to desecrate her own mother's memory for nothing more than material gain. For Alex, the collapse was less social and more absolute. His construction business, always seeming a bit of a house of cards, didn't just get shaky, it began to disintegrate in real time. Several banks, I heard, rescinded loan offers in a heartbeat once the reality hit them. Eleanor was no longer in the picture, to act as the silent, ever-present guarantor. Then the clients began to pull out, one by one, refusing to place their faith in a company that had just lost its financial 15 soul. In less than a month, his office was just a dark, empty shell. The company began to shed its skin, first a few key people, then, a month later, 2 more. Shadows walked out on their own, and Alex's rage, it became a presence in their house, a third, unwelcome resident. A storm without a center, and for all his shouting at the walls, he couldn't mend the cracks, appearing in the foundation of their life. And through this slow-motion wreckage, I watched Marion move with the silence of a ghost, methodically detaching herself from their shared wreckage. Her bag contained not just items, but the barest bones of a new existence, and she pointed her car towards the deep green quiet of the woods, back to the cabin, back to Eleanor's sanctuary, allowing the ancient stillness of the trees to wrap around her like a protective shroud. Here, the very air tasted different, as if it had been scrubbed clean of the city's lies, holding none of the metallic tang of failure or the suffocating weight of unspoken resentments she'd fled in Tacoma. From my vantage, I saw her begin to inhabit this place, not just occupy it, finding a kind of gravity in the floorboards that she had lost years ago. Every sound was a memory, the groan of old wood settling, the sharp, clean perfume of cedar, mingling with the ghost of lavender, the low thrum of the wind as it combed through the pines. This wasn't a house. It was a fortress of solitude built around her, and in the deep blue of the evenings, she would unfold the fragile paper, a ritual of rereading, the last will and testament of Eleanor's spirit. The words were a stark command: forgive no one. Let them break themselves upon your silence. When they finally crawl back, offer them a smile as cold as stone, and turn your back. And something, this time, had finally clicked into place within her. The ink on the page hadn't changed, but its meaning sharpened, no longer a blade of cruelty, but one of truth. It was a map to survival. The familiar ache of guilt had finally dissolved, leaving behind not a void, but a clean, cold clarity, and that formidable, quiet strength that Eleanor had bequeathed to her, a legacy of resilience she was now ready to claim. This new life in the woods began to weave itself into her spirit, not upon her, but through her, like patient moss reclaiming an ancient stone. Her morning ritual was a pilgrimage, a slow walk through these quiet rooms, as if listening for the echoes of the woman who came before. I felt her soaking in the quiet warmth Eleanor had woven into these very walls. Yet, as the sun rose and set, I observed a shift in her. She began to see not just what was, but what was left undone, an echo of an unfinished purpose. It was a thread of intention, woven into every object she touched. The journals she traced with her fingertips, the careful order of things, the shelves that didn't speak of an ending, but of a waiting. This place wasn't a tomb, it was a stage, meticulously set. It was waiting for a new story. Eleanor had always wanted this place, to breathe with life once more. I remember the afternoon it finally clicked for her. She was on the porch, still as a stone, her gaze lost in the forest. The light slanted through the pines, painting patterns on the worn wood, and then I saw the understanding dawn on her face, soft and certain as the light itself. She finally understood. Eleanor hadn't built a refuge from the world. It was never meant for solitude alone. It was constructed for something more. It was built for renewal. I watched her reach for the phone, her movements now filled with a new resolve. Her voice, when she spoke to Alice, was clear and steady. "I want to make the cabin into something that matters," I heard her say. "A sanctuary for people who feel like Eleanor did. For those the world has forgotten," she finished, her words hanging in the still air. On the other end, Alice wasn't surprised. Of course she wasn't. Eleanor had often spoken of this dream, of wanting her home to be a haven. "If you're truly ready," Alice offered, "I know the way. I can help you navigate the process of creating a non-profit." And so began the journeys. In the weeks that followed, I watched Marion go down the mountain to Tacoma, meeting with Alice again and again. She returned each time with stacks of paper, a quiet determination in her eyes. She was untangling the complex web of Washington state's regulations. Each form signed was a stone laid for the foundation of her new purpose. Strangers came with clipboards, measuring and checking, ensuring this sanctuary would meet all the necessary safety codes. And while they did, Marion began to scrub. I'd hear the sander whining late into the night, scraping away the years from those old floors, and see her silhouette against the window frames she was mending herself. She wrestled with those ancient light fixtures, one by one, and then came the scent of fresh paint on the breeze. At first, we just watched. But then a few of us from down at Lake Quinnell couldn't stand it anymore and went over to help. With every board replaced and every nail driven, something began to shift. The cabin wasn't becoming a new place. It felt more like it was remembering itself, waking up from a long sleep and stretching into the bones it was always meant to have. The day she finished, a stillness fell over the woods. I saw her standing there in the doorway, just looking out, a quiet exhaustion and a fierce pride on her face. Above her, the sunlight caught the raw, carved letters of a new wooden sign, the House of Hope. The name traveled on whispers through the hollows and into the nearby towns. We weren't sure what to expect that first day, but we knew something was happening. I'd never seen so many cars parked along that narrow road, snaking up the hill like a pilgrimage. One by one, I saw them arrive, dozens of familiar faces. The town's forgotten people stepped across that threshold, widows whose porches had been empty for years, old men whose quiet lives echoed with the absence of their children. They walked in hunched and silent, ghosts in their own lives. People you'd pass on the street every day, but whose eyes you'd stopped meeting long ago. And inside, that little cabin seemed to expand, to hold them all. The air grew thick with the low murmur of conversation, the warmth of hands finding others. Then, a sound we hadn't heard in that house for a long time, a soft, hesitant laughter. Marian moved among them, not as a hostess, but as a guardian, offering tea, a steadying arm, or just the shared silence of watching the flames dance in the fireplace. You could feel Eleanor in that room. It was undeniable. It was in the precise way the afternoon sun slanted across the walls, in the faint, lingering scent of lavender that always clung to her sweaters. I watched as people, strangers to one another, began to speak their truths, as if the very air gave them permission to finally be seen for who they were. Then I saw Margaret, one of Eleanor's dearest friends, make her way toward Marian. Her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. "You know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her hands reaching out to clasp Marian's. "You are just like a—" The word seemed to materialize in the quiet hum of the room. Continuation. It didn't need to be spoken. It settled into the space, finding a home. In the steady set of Marian's shoulders, as she surveyed her domain. It was a tapestry of mended lives. This room, the gentle click of knitting needles, where a circle of women gathered by the pale light of the window, a man whose hands coaxed soft, wounded melodies from the fretboard of a worn-out guitar. By a bookshelf, two sisters, their faces maps of a shared widowhood, sorted through, the paper spines of donated books. This was the ghost of Eleanor's dream, made solid, and watching Marian, one could see the quiet click of realization, a truth that settled, not with a shock, but with the grounding weight of stone. She had become the vessel for every hope Eleanor had ever held for this place, for these people. She was the quiet guardian of lives the world had tried to erase, the keeper of a sanctuary built from a dying wish, a living, breathing extension of the woman who saw in her a strength she hadn't yet recognized in herself. The first true bite of the season's cold arrived with the dawn, a silent predator settling over the Quinault rainforest, hushing the world. It was on this morning that Alex's car appeared. A fragile lace of frost clung to the thorns of the wild rose bushes that guarded the path, and the air itself was a sharp, clean wound, tasting of pine and the coming winter. Marian had been outside, her movements a steady, rhythmic prayer, stacking firewood against the cabin wall, when a foreign sound tore through the quiet. The grinding crunch of tires spitting gravel. She didn't flinch, but her work stilled. She straightened, a slow uncoiling of her spine, her hands brushing sawdust against the rough fabric of her coat as Alex emerged. He stepped out of his car, and he was a stranger. He bore no resemblance to the man who had walled off his mother's memory, who had dismissed her final chapter. With the hollow finality of a shrug, his suit was a geography of wrinkles. His hair was wild, and his eyes were dark craters, burned out and empty. They were the eyes of a man haunted by 1,000 sleepless nights. He began to walk toward the cabin, each step an immense effort, as if the cold air had turned to glass around him. I saw him from my window, his hands fumbling at the old wooden gate, a frantic energy in his movements that spoke of desperation. His voice When he called her name, Marion was thin and frayed, torn apart by the biting evening wind. And then she appeared, moving not with the haste he craved, but with a deliberate, almost chilling calm. She stopped just short of the gate, a sentinel guarding her own quiet world, refusing to bridge the gap. I watched her hands, how they came to rest on the weathered latch, not to open it, but to claim it as a barrier. That simple stretch of wood between them suddenly felt like a chasm, a line drawn in the sand. The air was so cold you could see their breath, two separate clouds of steam that refused to mingle. "What is it, Alex?" Her voice was level, devoid of warmth, a stark contrast to the tremor in his. He cast a furtive glance down the street, his body trembling beneath a thin jacket. He stammered, his gaze falling to the ground. "I need help," he finally whispered. $5,000. "Just until things settle," he added, a pathetic justification that hung empty in the air. His tone was a chaotic mix, a blade sharpening with resentment even as it begged for mercy. "You have it, don't you?" The question was an accusation. "She left everything to you." The words were laced with a poison that had been brewing for a long time. Marion's face remained a placid mask. "I can't help you," she stated, the words as final as a closing door. I saw the muscle jump in Alex's jaw, a tiny, violent tremor of disbelief and rage. "So, that's it? You just shut me out because she always liked you more?" The self-pity was palpable. "Because you got the house, the money." His voice started to climb, each word a new grievance. "Everything." It came out as a near shout, cracking under the strain of his own bitterness. "You've become so cold, Marion," he spat, the insult meant to pierce the armor she wore. "I don't even recognize you anymore." From my vantage point, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a shadow that could have been mistaken for pity, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a resolve that seemed forged in ice. It was something harder, something older than pity. She took a single step closer, her knuckles white on the gate, her power absolute in that small space. "Your mother loved you," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to lean in. "More than you could ever possibly comprehend. But you didn't love her back," she finished, the words delivered with surgical precision. Not in any way that truly mattered. A heavy silence fell, the truth of her statement echoing in the space between them. "And," she added, her voice unwavering, "you don't get to rewrite that history now." A tremor passed through him, a phantom of his old rage, but it was a hollow echo in the vast silence. His voice frayed. "So you think you're somehow better than me now?" "No." The word left her lips, not a defense, but a quiet certainty. Her voice was as steady as the frozen earth beneath their feet. "I simply stopped being convenient." His breath plumed in the frigid air, a cloud of disbelief as he stared, the cold, a merciless truth against his skin. It mingled with something darker that flickered in his eyes. Recognition. A truth, like a splinter of glass he could no longer ignore, no matter how. His pride clawed against it. She took a single, deliberate step back, from the cold iron of the gate, a silent, final closing of a door. "You should go, Alex." The conversation was over. "There's nothing left for you here." For a long, stretched moment, he remained motionless, a man made of stone in a world that had moved on. He stood there, swallowed by the immensity of the silent forest, seeming to shrink in its ancient shadow. Then, with a slow, broken grace, he turned and walked back to his car. Its engine tore the quiet, and then he was gone, leaving Marion to stand alone in the sharp, cleansing cold of the morning, her form unshaken, her spirit resolute, and finally, completely, irrevocably free. One full turn of the seasons later, the Quinault rainforest seemed to breathe with a new rhythm, not quieter, not louder, but with a deeper sense of life. The Staff House of Hope had become more than a cabin. It was a small, but steady heartbeat, deep within the community's chest. Every week, people who had once walked solitary paths through the trees found their way, drawn to the warm, amber glow spilling from the cabin's windows. On Tuesdays, Marion's weekly dinners filled the home with light and laughter. From my corner, I watched the main room transform, long tables stretching out like lifelines. Upon them sat the ghost of Eleanor's past, a mosaic of mismatched plates, each one a silent story she'd gathered through the years. I saw the widows from the outlying towns arrive, their offerings of homemade pies, a currency of shared grief and quiet strength. I saw my fellow veterans, men of few words, finally unburdening themselves of memories that had been locked away for decades, their voices raspy with disuse. Neighbors, who once were just faces behind fences, now lingered, their reluctance to leave hanging in the warm air long after the last dish was put away. I'd listen to the laughter, how it would rise, and curl around the old wooden beams, a gentle sound that seemed to sand down the brutal, sharp edges that winter always carved into our solitude. Fridays took on a new rhythm, a ritual of game nights. The whisper of card decks, shuffling became the room's heartbeat. I'd watch the checkerboards, small arenas of silent, focused battle, the clicking of pieces a gentle percussion. Old rivalries bloomed, but they were the kind that stitched people together, woven from the most innocent and joyful threads. I would track Marian's movement, a quiet dance, as she drifted between the clusters of us, her hands offering tea refills, or a warm blanket for knuckles stiffened by age and cold. In her, I saw an anchor, a steadying force in the shifting tides of our lives, and then the sacred hush of silent Sundays descended, hours suspended in time, given over to the quiet work of the soul. Reading, the soft click of knitting needles, the scratch of a pen in a journal, or simply watching. The world dissolved behind a window pane as rain drummed its soft lament against the glass. For all of us, I think, it became the week's most sacred appointment. But for Marian, I could see it was something more. It was a revelation, a slow, dawning truth that a quiet space didn't have to be an empty one. That silence was not the same as loneliness. With every month that bled into the next, I watched something fragile and powerful take root in her gaze, something I recognized in myself, the profound, grounding feeling of belonging that she'd never truly allowed herself to feel. It wasn't because this was her house, her project, but because my very walls had become part of her story. They no longer came to my door seeking to take. They came to offer something quiet, something deeply human, a shared piece of healing. When the first full circle of seasons passed since Eleanor was gone, I watched Marian make her quiet preparations for a remembrance. That evening, their footsteps crunched in the snow, dozens of them, gathering just beyond my porch. The deep Washington winter felt like a physical weight, pressing in, but the glow from the candles they carried held the darkness at bay. I saw their small flames dance in hands, cupped against the wind, as the voices of Margaret, then Diane, and others I recognized, wove memories of Eleanor into the cold air. Some stories were soft, some sparked with laughter, but all of them resonated with a truth I had witnessed. Marian was the last to move into the light. Her words were few, a mere breath in the night. They didn't need to be more. Everything she could have possibly articulated was already soaked into my timber, my very foundation. It was there in the faces, illuminated by the flickering glow. It was present in the silent strength of this gathering. A community, Eleanor, had unknowingly anchored here. A foundation she had, built for them all. Much later, when the silence returned, Marian came back to me. I felt the familiar creak of the floorboards as she sat at the small writing desk. There it was, the manuscript, the collection of letters that had given her a reason to stay. A finished book, sculpted from the pages of Eleanor's journals, from her private letters, from the profound shape of her grief and the echo of her quiet defiance. A story that now belonged to the two of them, forever intertwined within me. Before the lamp went out, she opened my door one last time, stepping out toward the old oak behind. My own boughs arched over the little cabin, a silent guardian in the dark. Then, a fragile warmth pressed against me. Her hand had found its way home. I felt her trace the deep grooves of my skin as the forest hummed a song only we could hear. A vibration traveled through my core. Her voice, a promise whispered just for me, "You weren't forgotten." The words ghosted on the frosted air, a fragile plume of breath carrying the rest of her soul. And, now, neither am I. A truth so profound, the wind itself awoke to listen. It swept her declaration from her lips, lifting the sound through my network of needles and twigs, weaving it into the very crown of my being, the place where all secrets are kept and finally understood.